As we take a look at the little postcard to Philemon, we outlined it in this way. In the first 7 verses, we saw Paul's appreciation. In verses 8 and 9, we see Paul's approach. In verses 10 through 16, we see Paul's argument. In verses 17 through 19, we see Paul's account. In verses 20 through 22, we see Paul's assurance. And then in verses 23 through 25, we see Paul's associates. We started out last time by noticing Paul's appreciation. Paul opens this little postcard with a number of verses showing appreciation for Philemon, thanking him for who he is and for what he has done. He refers to him as dearly beloved in verse 1, which shows the great love that Paul had for this man. Their relationship was very, very close in the Lord. Also notice that he calls Philemon a fellow laborer. Paul does not take full credit for all that has been accomplished, but rather he gives Philemon credit for what has been accomplished in the congregation of Colossae. He says that Philemon has had a part in that, and he acknowledges that and thanks him for that work. Notice he tells him as well in verse 4 that he thanks God, mentioning him in his prayers. It is interesting to go through the New Testament and notice the number of individuals that Paul says that he prayed for and that he remembered in his prayers. How long is your prayer list? How many people do you pray for? Do you pray for just yourself? Do you pray for just your family? Do you pray for other families? Do you pray for how many individuals by name are mentioned in your prayers? Paul mentions a number of congregations as well as a number of individuals in his prayers. Are you praying for this congregation? Are you praying for the congregations throughout this area? Are you praying congregations that you know of where maybe your children attend or loved ones attend? Are you praying for those congregations that they might always be sound, that they might be faithful, that they might be active in doing the work of the Lord? That's, of course, what Paul does here. Now, Paul says as well in verse 5 that he has heard of his love and he's heard of his faith. He's commending Philemon for these two great qualities, love and faith. Not only love for God, but love for the brethren. Faith in God, trust in God that God will provide for his needs. And notice that he says in verse 6 that he has heard of the communication of Philemon's faith. True faith speaks. True faith declares some things. You can go to James chapter 2, and you remember that James there is making an argument about faith and how that salvation is not by faith alone, or it's not by faith only, but rather that if you can show me your faith without your works, James says, I'll show you my faith by my works. I'll allow my faith to do the talking. I will allow my faith to show you how much I trust God, how much I believe in Him. And Philemon's faith was communicating. It was communicating the great trust that he had in God. And Paul was hoping that on this occasion that Philemon's faith would be up to the task at hand. That Philemon's faith would be great enough to forgive Onesimus and to incur this debt and to forgive this debt, that the gospel might spread and that people might be amazed at the difference that Christianity had made in this slave owner. Now, most slave owners, when they caught a runaway slave, they punished him very severely. In fact, they were encouraged by other slave owners to do that. And if Philemon did not do that, then it would be an opportunity for Philemon to make an argument to them as to why he didn't do that. They might not understand that, but at least it gave him the opportunity of teaching them and telling them about forgiveness and how he had been forgiven, and therefore he owed a debt to others as well. He talks about as well the great joy and the consolation that he has found in Philemon. There are some brethren that burden you, and there are some brethren that bless you. There are some brethren who are of a concern to you because they're not living as they ought to be living, because they're not dependable, because they're not involved in the things that they should be involved in, and perhaps they're involved in things that they should not be. And so for elders and for preachers and for those who are working in the church, they're a burden, they're a concern. But Philemon was not a concern. but rather Philemon was a source of great joy. He was a source of great comfort. Because Paul knew what he was doing. Paul wasn't concerned about him. Paul wasn't concerned about his salvation. He wasn't concerned about what Philemon was involved in. No, he was comforted by the thoughts of Philemon. Now, there are certain people, I suppose, that I could call by name in this congregation. And perhaps when you would call their names, there's a smile that spreads across our face. Because we know what they're doing, and we know what they're involved in, and we know how much they love the Lord, and we know how much they love the church. But then there are others that we might call their name, and we might be concerned about. Because they're absent, because they're not involved, or perhaps because of things that they are involved in as far as the world is concerned. But that was not the case with Philemon. He even says that the bowels of the saints are refreshed by him. Not only was his life a joy and a consolation to Paul, but it was a joy and consolation to the church. The church felt better because Philemon was a part of it and because of the work that Philemon was doing. He was refreshing the church. There are some individuals that drain from the energy of the church, and there are others that give energy to the church. And we ought to strive to be those who give energy to the church. We ought to strive to be those who are refreshing people rather than those that are constantly taking refreshment from others and drawing away from the life and the energy of the church. Now, as we think about this, we want to move into our discussion today, and that is beginning in verses 8 and 9. We want to talk about Paul's approach. Paul's approach. Now, we know that Paul was an apostle, and we know that as an apostle, Paul had every right to give commands, to give orders, as long as they were in accordance with the will of the Lord. He had the power to do that, and there were occasions, of course, when he did do that. 2 Thessalonians 3:6 is an example of that, where he said, "We command you, brethren, in the name of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, that you withdraw yourselves from every brother that walketh disorderly, and not after the tradition which you received of us." And so there were times when Paul would lay down a command, and he would say, "Here's what you have to do." He did so in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. Regarding this brother who had taken his father's wife, he gave a commandment for them to put away the evil, put away that brother from among them. And so there were times when Paul laid down commandments. And Paul says in the context here that he could have done that relative to Philemon and this situation with Onesimus. But he wasn't going to do that. That was not going to be his approach. His approach was going to be a very humble approach. His approach was going to be to beseech, to beg, to plead with Philemon. Notice in verses 8 and 9, he says this, "Wherefore, though I might be much bold in Christ to enjoin thee that which is convenient, yet for love's sake I rather beseech thee, being such a one as Paul the aged, and now also a prisoner of Jesus Christ." Paul says, I might be much bold in Christ to enjoin thee, that is, to command thee or to order thee. That's within my power, Paul says, and that could be my approach. I could do that because it would be easier to do that. It would be easier, he says, it'd be more convenient for me to simply tell you what to do. But Paul wasn't concerned just with Philemon doing the right thing. He was concerned with the development of Philemon. He was concerned with Philemon making the right choice. You know, there's a situation that comes up very, very often in parenting where you can simply tell your child what to do. You can give your child an order or give your child a command. And there are times, certainly, when that is the appropriate way to do things. But you want your child to develop, and you want your child to learn to do the right thing, and to do it of their own volition, to do it because it's the right thing to do, and not simply because you made them do it, or you forced them to do it. They're doing it because it's the right thing, and because they've learned it's the right thing, and because that's what they want to do. And that's the way that Paul approaches Philemon right here in verse 8. He says, "Yet for love's sake I rather beseech thee." Love's sake. Because of his love for Philemon, he wasn't going to give the command or give the order, but rather he was going to ask. He was going to beg or plead for Philemon to do this. You know, the way we approach people says a lot about what we think about people and how we feel about people and what our expectations are of people. Paul, in writing to the Corinthians, had to be far more direct than what he did in writing to the Philippians. Paul could simply write to the Philippians and outline what was right, and they would do it. But in writing to the Corinthians, that wasn't enough. In writing to the Corinthians, you had to give them far stronger encouragement than that. In fact, Paul would sometimes suggest a rod and the necessity perhaps to bring a rod when he came, because they were a lot harder to get to do the right thing than what the brethren at Philippi were. But Paul's not going to have to do that with Philemon because of the love that he has for Philemon, because of the love that he knows that Philemon has for him, because of the love that Philemon has for the Lord, and because of the love that Philemon has for the brethren. Paul says, I can simply ask you to do this, and I'm confident that it will be done. He says, I rather beseech thee, or I beg thee, I'm pleading with thee. It is again interesting to go through the epistles that Paul wrote, and since he did write so many epistles, we have the opportunity to do this, and to study that little word beseech, and see how many times that was Paul's approach rather than the command approach. And I think we learn a lesson about how to deal with people and how to handle situations most of the time. Lord willing, in the worship hour this morning, we're going to talk about attendance and the need for being present at every service. Now, there are certainly two approaches that a person could take in dealing with that. The first approach is to simply outline, here are the commands of the Bible, and to simply condemn those who are not doing that. Is that right and good? Yes, it is. There are times when that perhaps is the approach that should be taken. But there are other times where maybe the approach that should be taken is to beg and to plead with individuals to consider what is right and to do what is right, to make the choice. Because after all, attendance and the failure to attend is a problem of the heart. The heart of the problem is a problem of the heart. That's what it is. And so we have to change hearts and we have to change minds if we want to change attendance habits. That's what we have to change. We can give a command, we can give an order, and certainly the Bible does that. But perhaps the better approach so often is to plead and beg with individuals to simply do what they ought to do. And to do it because they love the Lord, and because they want to go to heaven, and because they want to set the right example. And pleading and begging with them to do that. And that's the case with Paul right here. That's the approach that he takes. He says, being such a one as Paul the aged. Paul the aged. Our world is different in many ways than the first century world. And one of the ways in which our world is different is that age is not given the esteem today that it was in days gone by. But in days gone by, when a person had reached a certain age, there was an amount of respect that was due for that person. And there was a certain way that you were to treat that person. And you had the responsibility of listening to that person. Sometimes those that are older today are simply disregarded, pushed aside, considered as being out of touch with how things are. Now, Christian people don't do that, but our world does that. But Paul here, in writing to Philemon, says, I'm Paul the aged. See, Paul's pleading with him, but Paul is pleading with him in a very powerful way. And he says, Philemon, I'm older than you are. And so I'm asking you to listen to me. I'm begging you to consider the wisdom that I've gained over the years, to give some thought to this wisdom. Most individuals suggest that Paul was about 60 years of age at this time. Now, some of you are already past that point, and so 60 may not seem that old to you, but in Paul's years it was old. And it was old for this reason. Paul's life had been a hard life. Paul had been beaten a number of times. He had been in prison. He had suffered shipwreck. He had spent a night and a day in the deep. Paul's life had not been easy. And so even though he was just 60 years of age, which was fairly old for that day and age, without the medical care and without some of the things that we have today, that was up in years for that time period. But when you consider the amount of stress that Paul had been under and the toll that life itself had taken on Paul, Paul must have felt even older than what the years were. And no doubt Philemon knew about that. And Philemon knew about his struggles and knew about the difficulties that Paul had faced. And so he says, such a one as Paul the aged. We don't know exactly how old Philemon was. He might have been somewhere near even the age of Paul. But Paul uses this as a persuasive tool with Philemon. He says, and now also as a prisoner of Jesus Christ. Well, Paul, first of all, brings up his age and the fact you ought to listen to me because of the years that I have and what I've gleaned from those years. But secondly, he says, I hope that you'll listen to me because I'm a prisoner. And here's the idea. Philemon, you may not be able to do anything about my captivity, my being enslaved. But Philemon, it's totally in your power to do something about Onesimus' situation. You may not be able to get me out of prison. You may not be able to save my life. But Philemon, you can save Onesimus' life. And you can deliver him from the bondage that he's in. And I'm asking you to do that. Paul had suffered so much for preaching the gospel. And Philemon had been one of the recipients of that gospel. Philemon's life was better because of Paul's work and because of Paul's suffering. And Paul says, Philemon, you know even when I write this, I'm a prisoner and you're a free man. There are some things that you can do that I can't do. And I'm pleading with you to consider what my situation... And consider that because I'm asking you to do this, the joy that will come to me if you'll do this. Philemon, I don't have a lot of comforts. I'm in prison. Philemon, there's not a lot of joy that comes my way. But Philemon, hearing that you've done this, hearing that you have forgiven this debt and you've taken Onesimus back and you have been forgiven, Paul says that will be a wonderful, wonderful thing for me. I'm asking you to do it on my behalf. Do it because I'm asking you to do it. Now, someone has suggested that there are 3 ways that you can get a person to exhibit a certain kind of behavior that you want them to show. The first is out of discipline. And that is because you have to. You can get your child to do the right thing through discipline. Because they have to. Because if they don't do this, here's what will happen. You'll lose these privileges. You'll get a spanking. There are consequences if you don't do this. And so, out of discipline, you can get a person to do the right thing. Generally speaking, that's the case. But think about it as well, that the second way is out of duty. And that is because they ought to. You can play the duty card. And you can suggest, it's your duty to do this. You have a responsibility to do this because of who I am, because of who you are. You have a duty and you owe this. And so they have to do it out of debt. But the third way is out of desire. And that is because you want to. Because you want to. Now, all 3 of those are effective. And all 3 of those are useful. And all 3 of those have their place. Why do we serve God? Well, we serve God out of fear of discipline, don't we? Because if we don't serve God, then we'll go to hell one day. And so we serve God because we have to. Or we have to face the consequences. But think about it as well, that we serve God out of duty, right? We serve God because we ought to. Because of what God's done for us. Because of the debt that He paid for us. Because He purchased our freedom. Because of the fact that Jesus took our place on that cross. Out of duty, we ought to serve God. We owe a debt. We ought to do it. But finally, and maybe before all of those other things, we ought to serve God out of delight. We ought to want to do that because of all that's been done for us. It ought to be the desire of our hearts to do that, to serve God. And really, in order to be pleasing to God, how does it have to be done? It has to be done from the heart. Can discipline be a motive? Absolutely. Can duty be a part of it? Absolutely. But is it acceptable unless our hearts are in it? You know, the Pharisees did some things out of duty, but their hearts weren't in it. There are a lot of people today who do things out of duty. There are people that are here this morning out of duty. There are people here this morning out of fear of discipline. But we need to make sure that we are always trying to do what we do out of delight because we want to, and not merely because we have to or we ought to. And so Paul is trying to get Philemon to do the right thing out of delight because he wants to. He's trying to get him to make the right choice, not by command, but by pleading with him and by encouraging him. Paul hopes to get him to do the right thing. Now, you know that people are different. And you know that some people can be commanded and they willingly submit to that command. And there are certain scenarios in life where that's the way the world works. If you've ever been in the military, that's the way the world works. Commanding officer tells you to do something. And you do it. It's the way it works in that world. If you don't do it, there's severe consequences. Next time you want to do it because you don't want the consequences. That's the way that works. But most of us don't live in that world. Most of us live in the civilian world. And in the civilian world, commands only go so far. In the military, they own you. They have control of your housing. They have control of you. How far you can go in a day, what you can do. They have control of you. And therefore, they can command you and expect certain things and bring those things about. But in the civilian world, it isn't that way. And so, command many times is not the best approach for us to take because we don't have that absolute control over people. There's more of a choice involved. There's more freedom, more liberty involved on the part of those that we're trying to get to exhibit certain behaviors. And so there's a great deal more of the approach that has to be the approach that Paul's taking right here rather than the other approach. Yes?
It's not unusual to see many people will start doing things out of fear of discipline, commands, but then they progress to the point where they want to do something.
Sure.
So that's not uncommon. But Paul, it's really smart the way he approaches him. He compliments him over and over in his decision, as far as how he's so pleased with him. He thanks God for him in his prayers all the time. It would be very difficult for him to even if he was tempted to not want to take his slave back. Paul made it hard for him to do that. But I think Paul already knew that he was already a fellow laborer in Christ. So he wanted to do the right thing, and he wanted to please God.
Right.
So that's the approach that he took.
And I think that's a good point. We ought to make it hard for people to do the wrong thing. And that's what our goal is. The world makes it hard for people to do the right thing. The pressure in the church ought to be the opposite way. We ought to make it hard for people to do the wrong thing. We ought to make it hard for people to skip the services of the church. We ought to make it hard for people to get in the world and do the things the world does. Because they know if they do that, we're going to come visit them. They're going to receive a call from us. We're going to come by, and I mean in a loving manner, and we're going to talk to them, and we're going to encourage them, and we're going to be there trying to get them to do the right thing. That's the approach that we ought to take. And generally speaking, most of us, and again, we have different temperaments. Children have different temperaments. But most of us receive this type of approach far better than we do the other. Because there are some of us that if we receive a command, we tend to buck against that. We tend to not want to do it simply because we've been told to do it, or we feel like we're forced to do it. And we want the choice. And that's becoming more and more with a modern mindset than it ever has before. And that's going to be one of the difficulties, perhaps, of winning the world for Christ in the future, is the fact that our world is becoming more and more that way. If you go back 40 years ago, individuals were willing to stand and have an open debate regarding various things. And they were willing to debate the pros and the cons of various things. How popular are debates today? People generally don't want to do that today. They don't like that type of approach. Then in the past, that was extremely effective. But today it's not nearly as effective as it used to be. Because the mindset is different. The approach of people is different today. People have been raised differently today. And it makes it harder and harder and harder to get across some of the things that we want to get across. And our approach is going to have to be adjusted accordingly in order to be effective in winning people for Christ. Now, as we look at the context and we continue talking about Paul's approach here, he didn't command him, he begged him, he pleaded with him. Now, that's pretty common in Paul's writings, that's the approach that Paul takes. He takes it over and over again. He found it to be effective, and it was, and we will find the same thing. But I want you to notice Paul's argument beginning in verse 10, where Paul begins to lay out, he's begged Philemon to do this, but that does not mean that Paul isn't going to give some logical reasons why he thinks Philemon ought to do this. Now, he isn't begging Philemon just to do this. He is begging Philemon to do this because it's the right thing to do. And now he's laying out the case for the fact that it's the right thing to do. Sometimes we beg people to do things simply because that's what we want them to do. And sometimes we beg them to do things that may not be the right thing. It's simply what we want or what's best for us. That isn't what Paul's doing here. Paul's not merely begging Philemon to do this, but rather he's begging Philemon to do it because it's the right thing to do. It's what Philemon ought to do. Now notice the argument beginning in verse 10 that Paul makes to him. I beseech thee for my son Onesimus, whom I have forgotten in my bonds. I want you to picture how this has happened. Onesimus ran away from Paul. He's been gone for some time because he made his way all the way to Rome. In the course of that, Paul converted him, and now Paul has sent Onesimus back home, evidently sending someone with him for his safety and for his security. But here is Philemon. Here are two men standing before him. One of them, a companion of Paul, the other one, his runaway slave. And as Onesimus is standing there in front of him, Philemon, no doubt, starts to read this letter. And he starts reading the first 7 verses, and Paul's complimenting him, and Paul's praising him. And then in verses 8 and 9, Paul begins to plead with him and beg him. But at this point, he doesn't yet know what it's about. He doesn't yet know. What is Paul going to beg me to do? And then when you get to verse 10, I beseech thee for my son, Onesimus. Now think about how those words must have hit Philemon. Paul's begging me. He's begging me for his son. I'd do anything for Paul. If this is Paul's son that he's begging me to do something for, name it, Paul. What is it? What does he need? What do you want me to do? I'll do it. And then Paul says, my son, Onesimus. You see, this runaway slave is my son. I'm asking you to do something on my behalf for him. He's my son. Now, no doubt, Philemon, when he read those words, knew instantly what Paul meant. He knew that Onesimus was not Paul's physical son. He knew that the relationship that they enjoyed had to be a spiritual relationship. And so he knows that Paul has converted Onesimus. Paul says, whom I have forgotten in my bonds. I've begotten him. You might very well say, I have baptized him. I have born him again. I've converted him. And notice that Paul says, I've converted him in my bonds. Have you ever considered how many people Paul converted while a prisoner? We know, for example, at the end of the book of Philippians, there were saints in Caesar's household, and evidently Paul converted those while he was imprisoned. He converted those high-ranking officials in Caesar's household. At the time, Paul had a Roman soldier chained to him 24 hours a day. They rotated in 4-hour shifts. And Paul and these jailers, these guards, were only separated by 18 inches of chain. So every 4 hours, Paul had someone new to talk to about the gospel of Jesus Christ. Paul had a captive audience. Oh, they were guarding Paul, but Paul had a captive audience. He had a man who was chained to him, who couldn't go anywhere for 4 hours. And so Paul could pray, and Paul could sing, and Paul could teach. And over the course of that process, Paul converted some of those who were guarding him. How many people have you converted? How many people have I converted? I don't have a chain on my wrist. You don't have one on yours. I can come and go. I don't have to wait for them to come to me. I can go to them. I don't have 18 inches of freedom. No, I can go anywhere and talk to anyone. How many people have I converted? How many people have you converted? You realize we're going to be in the same judgment with the Apostle Paul? Same great line, standing before the same great throne, answering before the same great judge. And think about those that will be there that Paul converted with 18 inches of chain. And who will we have converted with all the freedom and all the opportunities that we enjoy today? Paul didn't have the internet. Paul didn't have the radio. Paul didn't have the printed page in the sense that we have it today. He didn't have the means of travel that we have. He didn't have the freedoms and the prosperity that we do. And yet he converted people. And we are not doing that in large part in spite of all of those things. We're going to be in the same judgment with him. And he says that he has converted Onesimus. But notice he says as well, which in time past was to thee unprofitable, but now profitable to thee and to me. We talked about before that Onesimus, the name means profitable. And so he's making a play on Onesimus' name. And he says, this person who you named profitable became unprofitable. But Paul says he's living back up to his name again. He's profitable again. You ought to take him back because he will be what you wanted him to be at the beginning. He really will be that now. He wasn't that last time. He disappointed you. He let you down. He robbed you. But this time, he's going to be profitable to you and to me. He's going to be a blessing not only to you. You see, it isn't going to be just out of duty anymore. It isn't going to be just out of dread anymore. Now what Onesimus does, he's going to do because he wants to. And so he isn't just going to be a blessing to you because he owes you because you purchased him. He isn't going to do just what you want him to do because you can punish him if he doesn't. He's going to do what you want him to do because he wants to do it. You see, he's not only going to be a servant to you, he's going to be a servant to me, and he's going to be a servant to others because he's a different person than what he was before. He is a new man. Brother Marshall Keeble used to tell the story of a man who was beating his wife. Finally, it got to the point to where the wife wouldn't take it anymore. And she left and she went back home to her father. And the day came when that man came knocking on the door. And he said, I want my wife back. And the father said, you can't have her back. She's not coming back home with you. I've seen what you've done to her. You can't have her again. And the man said, you don't understand. I'm not that person anymore. I'm a different person today. You see, I was baptized. My heart's been changed. My sins have been removed. I know that was wrong, and I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm a different person today. Onesimus was a different person. things that he had done were horrible. He wasn't going to do them anymore. He was a new man. And Philemon wants to see this change that had been brought about in him. He says, whom I have sent again, thou therefore receive him, that is mine own bowels. Paul says, remember how I told you that I love you? How you're dearly beloved? He's dearly beloved. I love him now too. You see, he's my brother in Christ too. I have to love him as Jesus loved me, just as I have to love you that way. I feel the same thing for him that I feel for you. Whom I would have retained with me, that in thy stead he might have ministered unto me in the bonds of the gospel. Paul says, I'd love to keep him here with me. He's been useful to me. You're not here, you're there. He's here. He could serve me on your behalf. And I would love for that to have been the case. But in verse 14, but without thy mind would I do nothing, that thy benefits should not be as it were of necessity, but willingly. Paul says, but without your giving me permission to do that, Paul says, I won't do that. Paul says, I'm not going to take that which belongs to you and use it without you're giving me the permission to use it. You see, giving is to be willingly, not of necessity, according to 2 Corinthians chapter 9. And Paul was not going to put Philemon in a position to where he had to give grudgingly, or he had to give of necessity. If Philemon was going to give, Paul wanted it to be willingly, freely. That's the way people have to give in order for it to be acceptable. Paul understood that, and so he gives Philemon that opportunity. I don't know whether Philemon might have sent Onesimus back to Paul. He might have said, Paul seemed like he really needed you. You were of great comfort. I'm going to let you go back and serve him. Maybe that's what happened. We're not told. But if it did, it was because Philemon gave him and not because Paul took him. Paul was in Rome. Philemon was in Colossae. Paul could have taken Onesimus and used Onesimus, and Philemon wouldn't have been any wiser of the fact. Paul could have used him for years and only sent him home when he was old and perhaps broken down and not of use to him anymore. Paul doesn't do that because that isn't the right thing to do. Paul's going to do the right thing, and he's going to allow Philemon to do the right thing. Thank you for your attention. We'll pick up here, Lord willing, next time.